So I invite you to close your eyes and come within, and to know with me that there is absolutely one power and one presence, one divine spark of life that is forever emanating, is forever experiencing itself by means of us. And so I know this beautiful Easter morning, as we come together to be in spiritual community together, that we recognize our oneness. We drop down into that place within ourselves where we know no beginning and no end, where there is only the power and the presence of the one that is expressing itself in so many beautiful and amazing ways. I know that spirit shows up in many shapes and many sizes and many ages and in many beings. It knows life as much as it knows life in a human being as it does in a rock or a tree or a stream. And so in this moment, on this beautiful Easter morning or afternoon, depending upon where you are right now as you're listening to this, I know that we know our oneness, that there's a power and a presence that moves through the music and the ritual, our spiritual practice, the talk today. I know that it all comes together in power and in beauty, and that there is something that's being called forth that is greater than me, that is greater than all those that are listening to my voice. And so we simply allow ourselves to continue to call it forward, to be in great reception of that wisdom that we have brought forward, that already lives in us, that is just waiting to be received on a very visceral level. I'm grateful for this. I'm grateful for this time to be in community despite the fact that we can't be together. And so I simply release my word into the loving arms of the law. And I know that it is this deep embrace that carries it forward. And together we anchor this in power and truth by saying together, and so it is. I want to thank Elijah for that wonderful communion ritual, which is older than Christianity itself. We are one with the earth and with each other, and this has and will always be true. I've been really thinking about these holidays, it's Holy Week all over the world. There's people celebrating Passover, Good Friday, Easter, and I'm really struck by the parallels between the stories and these rituals and what we're experiencing today. Somebody very wise once said that those who fail to remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And I think there's quite a bit of truth in that. And while our philosophy isn't one where we have a lot of traditions and dogmas, I heard one of my beloved colleagues, Dr. Karen Kushner, say once that she believed that the only official holiday that religious scientists and Centers for Spiritual Living could celebrate was Groundhog's Day. You know, the Groundhog's Day of that movie that Bill Murray was in, where he kept waking up to the same day over and over again. Right, right. Well, that's kind of how we experience life as religious scientists. We recognize that we're going to continue to experience the same thing over and over again until we really step into a mindset or a shift of newness. And so, as we look at these holidays, and with that in mind, I want you to consider that while it's very easy to dismiss some of these traditions that other communities might be experiencing and practicing as just religious dogma, that there's power to be gleaned from the past, and it's very relevant to today. To me, as I look upon this global pandemic, I think that it really offers us an opportunity to step into consciously consciously evolving. I think that evolution itself is speeding up, and that as we have these experiences that are global in nature, we really have this sense of our oneness and our connectedness. Now, when we look at the Jewish holiday of Passover and the Christian celebration of Good Friday and Easter, we can see some common threads to what we're experiencing today in this pandemic. So if we look at Passover first, this is a celebration of freedom and liberation from control of the Pharaoh and Egyptian rule. As if you know the story, there were quite a few hardships that were brought upon the Egyptians and the Pharaoh because they refused to release the Israelites from their slavery. And so the Passover meal represents that celebration that they are being set free and that they have suffered through and they have thrived and they have survived the plagues of the day. Now, if we look at this Passover story from a more metaphysical point of view, we begin to see that the Pharaoh represents that egoic side of humanity, which desires to possess and control. And we can place the Israelites in this higher altruistic nature of humanity that knows and desires and continues to reach for its freedom and its unity and its love of mankind. And yet here we are 3,000 years later as we look at this Passover story, and we're still struggling, aren't we, between our desire and our attachment to the material world and our desire to love one another and to know unity and freedom and connection. Now I know in that Passover story, as it moves into the Exodus, the Israelites did transcend their slavery, yet it took them 40 years to finally come to the full embodiment of the freedom that of this idea of liberation that they finally realized. And if we begin to fold in the Christian holidays of Good Friday and Easter, we can see that 1,000 years later, we have the pattern that seems to continue to repeat itself. We have the egoic ideas versus the altruistic ideas and the knowledge of our true power and worthiness. Of course, Jesus' story around this time of year starts with the Passover meal where Jesus is breaking bread with his apostles. And of course, this is really the Passover meal. And Jesus breaks tradition and calls for the apostles to eat bread as a remembrance of the body, or metaphysically, that divine substance, and the wine as a remembrance of the blood or life. And this represents the circulation of divine ideas that will nourish and renew us always. It's a beautiful communion with our nature and each other. And so he has this Last Supper, and then he has his dark night in the garden, and the next day he rides into Jerusalem where he's not accepted. At first he's accepted, but he doesn't do what the people want him to do, and he's therefore crucified. The masses of people expect him to ride in as their new king. However, he's not interested in maintaining the status quo. His ministry is one of love and compassion and inclusion, where he's really scooping up the poor and the sick and the vulnerable, that no one, his claim is that no one is absent from God's love. No one is absent from Spirit's love. And much like the Last Supper, where he breaks from tradition, he's not interested in the egoic trappings of the world at that time. And so rejected by the Jews and rejected by the Romans, he's put to death. And as the story goes, he rises up in 3 days and transcends that death. Now, it's not really important to me whether you think this story is true or not. I think the really important thing to know about this story is that it's an allegory of death and rebirth. It's an allegory of death to the trappings of the world and a rebirth to that greater reality, our immortality, our true connection with Spirit. And so symbolically, Good Friday and Easter represent the death of the old paradigm and the leap into a whole new way of thinking. And so for our ego when we begin to even think about that, when we begin to think about what it would mean to let go of our ego and the wonderful trappings um, of the material plane, the things that, there's so much here to get our attention. However, I believe that the ego in us begins to look at this idea of all the things that it might let go of as giving up power and prestige and possessions, the things that keep it safe, the things that keep it alive. And yet the soul in this allegory of looking at letting go and renewal, it understands that this letting go of the material world, or at least our attachment to it, is standing in the principle for what truly matters in life, and that our true attachment is to our immortality and to the presence of who we are and the more of who we are, the reality beyond form. It's a lot of history to take in one moment, I know. And it brings me to here we are in the 20th century, the 21st century, actually, and in 2020. And we're in the midst of this global pandemic. And we've been asked to let go of what I'll call the corporal world, that material world that we've all come to depend on, all the things that we think we need to survive and thrive in life. And we've been asked to pull back and to go within our homes for the betterment of everyone on the planet. And so I know that some of us are self-isolating because we're vulnerable, and some of us are self-isolating because we're in fear. But I would say the vast majority of us, even those who are self-isolating because of their health, are doing this for deep compassion for our world and our planet. This is an amazing step forward for humanity to be willing to set aside the material world for the betterment of all. I really believe that it's times like these that define us. And as we look back on our history, I think we continue to see those struggles of the egoic patterns versus the higher vibratory patterns that are the nature of the struggle of our human experience. Think back about my own life. About 20 years ago, I found myself in somewhat of a similar situation. I was living in Baltimore and I was commuting to DC. I had this big important job with an international nonprofit. I was making a lot of money. I was able to support my family. We were very comfortable, but I was miserable in my job. I had all these things happening at home. My ex-husband, the husband at the time, was very sick with Lyme disease. I had two teenagers that were a little bit out of control. I had this crazy commute where I was driving from Baltimore to DC. I was spending 12, 14 hours a day out of the house with all this stuff happening, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. I felt like I had to stay where I was, because if I were to let go of that job, it would mean I'd be letting go of all the things that sustained us, the very lifeblood of our family, if you will. Well, all of that changed suddenly when the world shifted on its axis and some planes flew into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And there was a great loss of life. And I was cracked wide open by the sorrow and the pain and the shock. And I was somehow plugged into what was the only way I could describe it was it felt like a global sorrow. And it opened up my heart, and it helped me to wake up from a deep sleep that I was in this maintenance of a life that was more than a 9 to 5, because I was in DC all day and then go home, go to sleep, start over and do it again. All for what I thought was a paycheck and the only way I could support my family. And so when this happened, when I woke up, it was like this visceral awareness that I had a responsibility to all those who died. I had a responsibility to all those who had given their life in the World Trade Center. I had woken up, I had awakened, and I didn't want to go back to sleep again. I wanted their lives to mean something, at least in my life. And so I made a vow that I would never go to sleep again. And it was within the next month that I found myself in my very first Centers for Spiritual Living community. And my life changed forever. Nothing was ever the same again. I was able to quit my job and to trust that I was going to be okay. And yes, there was doubt, and there were moments when I thought I was insane for leaving all of that behind. But I knew that this was a serious moment in my life, and that it was time for me to really step into the greater goodness, the greater Alice of who I was supposed to be. And so my life has never been the same. And I can tell you that today I know a freedom that I did not know existed before. It was an evolutionary leap for me into a new existence. And I died to an old way of being. And I would say over a 15-year period, I was able to begin to really embrace and embody a whole new belief system. And that belief system has really served me in a way that has set me free. And I feel awake today. And I feel alive, and I feel connected. I think humankind is facing another wake-up call yet again. And I know that many of us are waking up. We're on the precipice of newness in our world. And as I see it, things can go either way. We can choose to pioneer a new reality that is kinder to ourselves and the planet and to each other. Or when this is all over, we can try to recapture and recreate what we had before. This is the human condition. When we are faced with these crossroads, it is time to make a decision. And it takes courage, and it takes being awake, and it takes support. I think that we forget who we are until we are awakened to it. I know that that story I described to you, I've had many other deaths and reawakenings through heartbreak and loss. And each time when I choose to lean into the heartbreak, there's this great release to my greater wholeness and power and freedom. And I know that's true for me, and I know that's true for you. And while I don't pretend to know how that's going to show up for you individually or even for us collectively, I know that there's a great deal of power in letting go or in symbolically dying in order to birth a newness. And I just know that we can't go back to the way things were. And frankly, if you choose to see this time as a rebirth, Mother Earth has begun her contractions. We don't know how long she's going to be in labor or what's on the other side of this. This isolation is not the new normal. We have not yet arrived to any new normal. It's just the beginning. I have a teacher who likes to say that incomplete endings inhibit new beginnings. And so my invitation to you is not to rush into newness, to know that this is a process. There's a wonderful author, William Bridges, who wrote a book called Transitions, and he says that there are 3 stages that we move through, 3 steps, if you will, to move from where we are to a new beginning. And of course, every new beginning starts with an ending. And at the first step, that we begin to identify what it is that we're letting go of. We need to be conscious of it. We need to lean into it. We need to begin to really understand what it is that we're letting go of, and to inhabit the reality of these losses that we're experiencing. When we can be really present about what we want to leave behind, we can be more conscious about what we want to hold on to. Bridges goes on to say that the next step is this neutral zone that we step into. And it's the time after we've decided to let go, where we're in the in-between, and where the old is gone, but the new isn't fully orbed yet. This is when we begin to realign ourselves and we begin to create the new patterns for our life. It is the time between the old reality and our sense of identity and the new one that we're giving birth to. And during this time in the neutral zone, it's perfectly normal to experience some confusion, some concern, some stress. That's our human nature. It's kind of like the chrysalis process, being in the cocoon. The caterpillar has completely liquefied, but it has not yet started. The imaginal cells have not started to begin to take shape, to begin to create whatever the new form is. This neutral zone is like a beautiful seed bed for new beginnings. And then, of course, the third stage is the beginning itself. And when we step into the new beginning, we begin to understand what we really value. We begin to get clearer on what our attitudes are and the understandings about what it is we want to experience in this new beginning. And when we step into this new beginnings, they're marked by a huge release of energy in a new direction. Many of you have probably experienced that, where you've had something new happen and there's almost a force that carries you forward and great momentum. And we begin to have a sense of our fresh identity. We feel a new sense of purpose and how we will contribute and participate in life. We're renewed. I think that if we look at this idea of transitions and transformation and new beginnings, that globally we are still in the very early stages of this. We have to ask ourselves the questions, what are we letting go of? What is it that we want to carry in with us into the neutral zone? And how can we presence ourselves fully in the in-between before we begin to lean into and tap into a vision and set some intentions? This time of change can be temporary, or it can lead to true transformation, where we can begin to repattern our thinking and our behavior and make room for newness. This is the time. This is the pathway to our new normal. And this is what we're headed to if we decide and choose to move through this consciously and awake. I'd like to think that the new normal will be a world that works for all. You've heard us say this before. We have a beautiful global vision that we will be sharing with you more in depth. If it's not already on our website, we will have it on our website shortly. But it's this beautiful idea that the world can work for everyone. We have an opportunity to set our vision high for humanity and to lean into creativity and new possibilities. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll talk about consciously moving into the neutral zone and generating the energy and the momentum to create a newer, better, beautiful world we all know is possible. I thank you very much for joining us for this, our time together for this Easter Sunday, for really exploring these big ideas with me and for being willing to press in to those places that are calling for you to let go, those places that are calling for you to embrace the better of who you are and who you've come to be. I invite you now to join me in prayer as we integrate what it is that is ours to do during this time of transition. So I invite you to close your eyes and take a deep breath and allow yourself to tap into a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for your enlivened mind, for your open heart, for this community of like-minded people that are supporting each other. Not just our community here in Santa Cruz, but the worldwide community of awakened souls that are choosing to express more fully to be their authentic self, to choose love whenever there seems to be a choice. What I know is that it's not either or, that it's both and. That we can inhabit the world that we live in, and we can make those choices that support each other. And so in this moment, I claim that for myself and for everybody within the sound of my voice, that we are clear about who we are, that we are clear about our purpose here on earth. We may have thought it was about a job or a relationship or something tangible and visceral. But I know that our true purpose is to reveal more love, to love each other fully, and to have that experience in our human condition. And so it is with deep gratitude that I remember this, that I recall this. And I know for each one of us that we remember who we are and who we've come to be, and we choose to move in that direction, for there really is no other choice. I give great thanks for this, and it is with a surrendered and grateful heart that I simply leave this to the embrace of Spirit that is forever rebirthing life through its own givingness to all humanity, to the planet, to the constellations, to the universe. For this and for so much more, I'm truly grateful. And together we say, and so it is.